There's a very strange moment when an old man sits motionless in a room filled with memories, and the only thing you can hear is time passing. No laughter, no background music, no attempt to soften the atmosphere, just the steady, cold ticking of a clock. As if it were counting down to something that should have been stopped a very long time ago. That man is Mel Brooks, a name inseparable from laughter, from satire, from the rare ability to turn the most painful parts of human life into something we can endure. For nearly a century, Mel Brooks has done one thing. He made the world laugh, even when it didn't deserve to. But this time, he isn't laughing, and it is that silence that feels most unsettling. Because in recent days, the world has been swept up in sensational headlines, breaking news, and cold, impersonal lines of text about a Hollywood family collapsing overnight. A case, a perpetrator, a tragedy people desperately want to believe came out of nowhere. But if everything truly was just a sudden outburst, why were the people closest to it not surprised at all? Some tragedies do not explode. They crack, very slowly, in silence, in tense dinners no one talks about, in justifications that sound loving on the surface, in repeated reassurances whispered to oneself, just a little longer, everything will be fine. And sometimes what destroys a family is not hatred, not malice, but love, with no stopping point. So what is the real question? At what moment does trying to save your child begin to become the fastest way to destroy that family itself? In this video, we will not rush to believe any story that has already been neatly told. Because the most dangerous thing is not what everyone is saying, it is what has been ignored for years. We will do two things in parallel. First, we will dissect the story spreading across social media. Why it has convinced millions of people that this was simply an unavoidable tragedy. And second, we will place it side by side with publicly available facts to find where the truth actually lies and where emotion has been pushed too far. Because if this is merely a criminal case, you can turn off this video right now. But if this is a story about the boundaries of love, then it is very possible that it does not belong only to Hollywood. It may be happening quietly, inside very ordinary homes, in places where people still call it love, while in reality, they are only postponing a truth no one has the courage to face. And by the time that truth is forced to speak, there is no way back anymore. To understand why everything unraveled beyond the point of return, we must go back very far. Not just a few years before the tragedy, but more than half a century earlier, to a time when these people were still learning how to live, how to love, and how to face pain in their own ways. The 1940s, 1950s, post-war America. In Jewish families in Brooklyn, humor was never merely entertainment. It was a survival weapon. Adults laughed so they would not collapse. Children learned to joke so they would not be afraid. And in that world, Carl Reiner became a symbol very early on, not only because of his talent, but because of the discipline and standards he imposed on himself. Carl believed in something old but unyielding. If you want to survive, you work. If you want respect, you take responsibility. And fame, if it comes at all, is a consequence, not a birthright. When Rob Reiner was born in 1947, he grew up in a home where laughter was always present, but so were expectations. Rob was not taught through dry moral lessons. He learned by watching. The way his father worked tirelessly, the way his father's friends, including Mel Brooks, turned tragedy into comedy, turned wounds into punchlines. That left a very particular imprint on Rob's psychology. He learned that everything could be endured if one was smart enough, patient enough, compassionate enough. When conflict arose, adults did not slam tables. They talked. When there was pain, they joked. When problems appeared, they believed time and affection would soften them. That became the foundation of the man Rob Reiner would later become. Someone who deeply believed that communication could redeem anything, that no conflict was truly unmanageable as long as one did not give up. In his film career, that belief carried him to the highest peaks. But in family life, it slowly became a trap. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, Mel Brooks was at once a friend, an uncle figure, and a generational role model. He belonged to a cohort that had witnessed war, loss, and understood very clearly that kindness must never be naive. For Mel, love always came with boundaries, because he had seen what happens when people are unable to say, "Stop." That difference did not initially create conflict. It simply existed quietly as two different understandings of the same concept: love. One side believed love meant staying no matter what. The other believed love meant knowing when to walk away before everything became beyond saving. Then, time passed. In the 1980s, 1990s, Rob Reiner became a major name. The Reiner family was no longer just a family. They became a symbol. And it was here that a small but dangerous detail began to appear. Inside the home, everyone still called Nick the boy, even after he had passed into adulthood. On the surface, it sounded like nothing more than a term of endearment. But psychologically, it kept Nick in a very particular position, the one who was always protected. When a child grows up with unconditional love but is not fully confronted with consequences, they absorb an unspoken lesson. Boundaries can always be stretched a little further. In ordinary families, that may lead to mild distortion. But in a family where fame softens every edge, where money delays hard decisions, and where love always overrides reason, that distortion is not corrected. It is nurtured. No one in this story began with bad intentions. Carl Reiner raised his child through discipline. Rob Reiner lived by faith in humanity. Mel Brooks carried the experience of a generation that had seen too much loss. Each man did what he believed was right in his own time. The problem is this: the world changed, but the psychological tools did not. And when a family continues using the values that once saved them in the past to confront an entirely different reality, tragedy does not need to knock loudly. It only needs patience until every boundary has worn away and no one has the courage left to rebuild them from the beginning. At that point, the story is no longer about right or wrong. It is about habits of love formed very early on. And the price paid when no one dares to ask the question again: is this way of loving still safe? When Rob Reiner stepped into the profession, he was not merely entering a job. He was stepping into a world with its own rules. A world where every story, no matter how private, could be dragged into the light, distorted and framed as a headline. By the late 1960s, Hollywood was no longer the romantic place of imagination. It was a machine. And that machine ran on image, reputation, and the ability to control the narrative presented to the outside world. Rob quickly realized something crucial. Here, talent might take you far, but stability is what allows you to survive. From his earliest roles, Rob learned that personal mistakes were never just personal. A small issue could become a scandal. A private conflict could turn into a crack in the image of a family. And when the Reiner name was tied to an entire legacy, that pressure no longer rested on one person's shoulders. It spread across the whole family. Hollywood taught Rob how to keep everything inside the house. Not through explicit advice, but through very clear consequences. Those who let their private lives spill into the public eye often paid a heavy price. And so, a culture of handling things internally required no enforcement. It formed naturally as a survival reflex. When Rob transitioned into directing and began to find success, that reflex only grew stronger. Each successful film did not just bring fame, it created an unspoken expectation. The Reiner family was a symbol of stability, decency, and civility. And for families who live under the spotlight for too long, preserving that image gradually becomes a priority, sometimes even above naming problems for what they truly are. In Hollywood, calling the police is not merely a legal act. It is a door flung wide open to the media. It turns private matters into public ones. It invites questions, judgment, and stories you no longer control. That is why many famous families, not only the Reiners, learn to delay, to soothe, to negotiate, rather than to sever ties. For Rob, this blended seamlessly with the personality already shaped long before. He believed in staying. He believed in dialogue. He believed that with enough patience, everything could be handled. Hollywood did not change that. Belief. It simply wrapped it in a layer of moral justification. Keeping family matters quiet was not only love, but a responsibility to the legacy. Years of success conditioned Rob to believe that every crisis could be managed. PR could soften public opinion. Time could dull the edges of anything. And if no one outside knew, then the problem had not yet gone beyond control. That logic, extremely common in the entertainment world, quietly became a way of life. No one told Rob that some situations cannot be managed through PR. No one told him that some problems become more dangerous the longer they are kept quiet. Because throughout his career, Rob had been shown the opposite. Silence had helped things pass. And slowly, without anyone noticing, the line between protecting the image and avoiding the truth began to blur. Rob grew accustomed to believing that every story he touched could reach a complete, satisfying ending. But real life does not follow a script. And by the time he realized that, it was already too late. From this point on, the spotlight no longer brought only glory. It began to create pressure. Pressure to preserve the image, pressure to prove that this family was still perfect. And it is precisely that pressure that will push the story into its next phase, where the spotlight reaches its peak, but the cracks within can no longer be hidden. In Hollywood, there is a particular kind of success that is especially dangerous. Not early success, not explosive success that flares up and fades, but success that lasts long enough to become taken for granted. For Rob Reiner, the peak did not arrive like an explosion. It came through the repetition of victory. Year after year, trusted projects, loyal crews, stable reputation, no major scandals, no obvious falls. Just a curve rising long enough for the human mind to form a very subtle illusion. I know what I'm doing. I've been through harder things than this. I can read every situation. This is the critical point. Long-term success does not only bring confidence, it creates a sense of control. And for storytellers, that sense is far stronger than for most people. Because they live in a world where chaos has structure, every conflict has a climax, and every story, given enough patience, can be guided toward a satisfying ending. Rob Reiner did not simply grow accustomed to success. He grew accustomed to controlling the rhythm. On set, when everything became chaotic, Rob did not panic. He slowed things down. When emotions ran too high, he lowered the tempo. When the story drifted off course, he adjusted the script. And most importantly, he always knew when to say cut, when to stop a scene, when to reshoot, when to abandon an approach that no longer worked. That very mechanism, so effective in art, created a deep belief. There is no situation that cannot be adjusted. But real life does not operate on that logic. In real life, there is no cut. There is no second draft for a wrong decision. There is no editing room where moments that went too far can be trimmed away. Yet, when you have spent decades in an environment where mistakes are fixable, it becomes extremely difficult to accept that some things, once they slip, cannot be pulled back by sheer will. At this stage, the aura of success is no longer about display. It is soft power. It is people trusting your judgment. It is being assumed to be the rational one, the balanced one, the person who never lets things spiral out of control. And when the world keeps reflecting that image back at you, it becomes a mirror that is very hard to break. The problem is, that mirror does not reflect reality. It reflects only what others need to believe. From here, a dangerous loop forms. The more successful someone becomes, the more they believe they are in control. The more they believe that, the more they delay hard decisions. And every delay that does not immediately produce consequences reinforces that belief a little more. It's fine. Everything is still under control. Just a little more time. That is how a long slide begins. Not with chaos, but with confidence that seems entirely reasonable. No one around objects, because the past has proven that this person is usually right. And that is precisely what makes the moment of losing control so difficult to recognize. Because when you believe you are directing the story, you fail to see that you have already become part of it. And when real life finally refuses to follow that familiar script, the fall does not come as a sudden accident. It arrives as the consequence of countless moments of telling oneself, I still have this under control. From this peak, the story does not need additional pressure to break. It needs only one variable that refuses to follow the familiar rhythm, and that is when everything begins to slip out of reach, slowly, quietly, but irreversibly. No family wakes up one morning knowing that it is moving closer to tragedy. If that were the case, everything would be far simpler. What is truly dangerous lies in the time before, a long, quiet phase that appears harmless, where every decision seems reasonable at the moment it is made. That is when the storm begins to form, but no one calls it a storm. At first, everything stems from fear. Not vague fear, but fears that are very specific, very human. The fear that if you push your child out, they will die on the streets. The fear that if you are too firm, you will lose them forever. The fear that one day, when everything is already too late, the most haunting thought will not be what you did, but what you failed to do. And when fear outweighs a person's capacity to endure, they no longer search for long-term solutions. They search for immediate calm. Just let today pass without conflict. Just let tonight be quiet. Just one more pause to breathe. In that moment, money is not a privilege. It becomes a numbing agent. Financial support in exchange for a few weeks of peace. A new opportunity to extinguish the current anger. One more concession to avoid confronting what no one wants to say out loud. No one calls this enabling. They call it love. But that kind of love has one very dangerous trait. Every time it works, it reinforces the belief that the choice was right. The brain learns quickly that if you just add one more thing, money, time, opportunity, the immediate wave will subside. And so instead of addressing the cause, the family begins to purchase silence. This is when something unnamed quietly takes shape. An unspoken economy. An economy of guilt. In that economy, money is no longer money. It becomes the language of atonement. If I keep giving, it means I haven't abandoned them. If I keep supporting them, it means I'm still a good person. If I can still do something, it means I haven't failed. Many wealthy families do not collapse because they run out of money. They collapse because they run out of strength. When dialogue no longer works, when every attempt to set boundaries leads to emotional explosions, money becomes the only way to avoid a confrontation they no longer have the energy to endure. And the longer this continues, the more the boundaries blur. Not because they don't understand that boundaries are necessary, but because every boundary comes at the cost of another emotional storm. For famous families, everything is complicated by another layer. They do not live only as parents. They live within a public identity, where they are seen as upright, progressive, empathetic, compassionate people. And when you have carried that image for too long, it no longer protects you. It becomes a trap. Inside that trap, saying no looks like cruelty. Cutting ties looks like betraying the values you once believed in. And admitting that something is beyond control means shattering an image you have spent a lifetime building. It is here that many people confuse empathy with surrender. They fear that if they set boundaries, they will become the kind of person they have opposed their entire lives. And so they choose silence, endurance, concession, not out of weakness, but out of loyalty to their own image as a good person. But the uncomfortable truth is this: empathy without boundaries does not save anyone. It only prolongs a situation that is already deteriorating until there is no way back. A hidden storm does not need violence to grow. It grows through decisions that sound perfectly reasonable, decisions made with good intentions, with love, with the hope that just a little more time will fix everything. The problem is this: when every effort is focused solely on keeping the surface calm, what is moving underneath is already beyond anyone's control. And by the time the storm reveals itself, it does not need extra energy to erupt. It needs only a single moment to expose the truth that what was once called love was, in reality, nothing more than a very long delay of a tragedy that had taken shape long ago. From the outside, it was still a beautiful house. Warm lights, closed windows. A place where anyone passing by would assume that everything inside must be peaceful. But inside, there was no longer any concept of living together. There was only survival. The most dangerous battles do not begin with shouting. They begin with changes in routine. Things so small that, if described, outsiders might find them trivial. But to those living inside, they become a map for getting through each day without triggering a landmine. Phone passwords are changed. Daily schedules are subtly offset to avoid crossing paths. Footsteps become lighter at night. Doors close earlier than usual. Voices drop, not out of respect, but to avoid drawing attention. When someone has to calculate their movements inside their own home, it is no longer a family. It is a hostile space disguised by beautiful furniture. No one says it out loud, but the body knows. Tension needs no explanation. It lives in the way you listen for sounds behind you, in checking your phone before stepping into the living room, in the reflexive question, "Is it safe right now?" The most frightening thing is this: at this stage, people still believe they are in control, because there has been no explosion, no obvious disaster yet. Each day that passes and feels fine becomes another piece of evidence reinforcing the old belief. Just be a little more careful. And it is precisely here that the fateful decision takes shape. Not in a moment of impulse, but across a long series of tense days where every choice is weighed against the same question. How do we make today no worse than yesterday? Many stories online describe this period as a chain of confessions, final phone calls, prophetic statements. But one important thing must be said clearly. Not all of those details are verified testimony. Most are the way people reconstruct tragedy after it has already occurred, when every fragment is viewed through the lens of the ending. Here is the reality check. We do not need to believe every word to understand the nature of what happened, because the lesson does not lie in specific details. It lies in the pattern. And that pattern appears again and again in countless family tragedies. Disaster rarely strikes like lightning from a clear sky. It resembles a storm foretold by hundreds of small signals, clear enough to feel, yet vague enough to be ignored. The final decision, whether to stay, to keep talking, or to try once more to maintain peace, usually does not come from blindness. It comes from a belief forged over many years that if you leave, everything will collapse faster, that if you are not there, someone else will absorb the full force of the rage, that your responsibility is to stand in the middle, to serve as the last barrier. In that moment, people do not believe they are stepping into danger. They believe they are doing the best they can, in a situation where every option is bad in its own way. And that is what makes this collapse so difficult to accept. No decision was made with malice. No action began with the desire to destroy. There was only a sequence of defensive choices, repeated for too long, inside a space that was no longer safe. When the truth comes out, outsiders often ask, why didn't they leave sooner? But the real question should be, at what point did leaving stop being an option at all? Because when a home turns into a psychological battlefield, the collapse does not occur in the final moment. It happened long before, on the day everyone began living as if they were preparing for the worst, while still telling themselves that things had not yet reached the point of needing to change everything. After the climax, people often turn their eyes to the courtroom, but a courtroom only closes the legal story. It does not close the aftermath. The real aftermath lives with those who remain, in the questions that return night after night. What signs did I overlook? At which moment should I have stopped? Why did I choose silence when fear was already speaking? Then comes shame. Not shame before public opinion, but shame before oneself. Shame in having to admit our family was not okay. For many families, and savos, especially those long regarded as upright, that truth hurts more than any outside judgment. After shame comes guilt, a kind of guilt few dare to name. Do I have the right to be afraid of my own child? That question is not moral in nature. It simply reveals something deeply human. There are fears that are not betrayals of love, but warning signals that were ignored for far too long. And at this point, the truth becomes painfully clear, even if it is hard to accept. Many families do not collapse from a lack of love, but from the absence of a timely no. The years that follow are not a beautiful recovery journey. There is no soundtrack, no dramatic arc. Only days spent learning how to live again with memory, learning how to name what was once avoided, and learning a lesson that comes late but cannot be escaped. Love cannot replace boundaries. If someone were to ask me whether this story has a rebirth, I would answer plainly, not in the way people usually hope for. Rob will not return. There is no miracle that can undo what has already happened. I have lived long enough to understand that some stories end permanently, and the most dangerous thing is pretending there is still a cinematic escape route somewhere. But I also do not believe that everything ends in meaninglessness. If this story has any form of renewal, it does not lie in a person. It lies in how we relearn the act of setting boundaries. I have seen too many families, Not only this one, believe that loving hard enough will somehow make everything turn out fine. I believed that myself for a long time, and I was wrong. Love without limits is not compassion. It is the postponement of tragedy. People often speak of tough love as if it were punishment. To me, it never was. It is safety first, hope later. Responsibility first, emotion later. It is the courage to accept that there are moments when saying no is the only way to protect everyone else in the room. But I also do not want to turn Rob's death into an easy lesson for people to swallow. I despise one-sided explanations. I despise the impulse to blame everything on illness, on addiction, on a single individual, and then consider the matter resolved. Family, violence, mental illness, they have never operated in isolation. They are a complex system, and anyone searching for a single spell to explain it all is merely comforting themselves. So if we speak of renewal, then for me it also means abandoning myths. Abandoning the idea that good people will always receive good endings. Abandoning the belief that empathy alone is enough. Abandoning the desire to find one sole culprit so our hearts can feel lighter. I'm not standing here to save an image nor to rewrite history into something more palatable. I'm standing here because if this story is to live on in any form, then it must live on as an honest warning. Love without boundaries can become the most deeply damaging force of all. And if there is one thing I hope others take from this tragedy, it is not how to love more, but how to love with enough clarity to stop at the right moment, before everything goes too far, and there is no way back. From a distance, people will say that Rob Reiner's legacy lies in cinema, in the films that shaped generations of audiences, in his place as a persistent, successful storyteller whose influence has endured within popular culture. That is true, and it will not disappear. But that is only the first layer of legacy, the most visible layer, and also the least controversial one. The second layer, and perhaps the one that prevents this story from ever truly closing, exists in real life. Here, legacy is not something to be displayed. It is something we are forced to confront. A painful lesson about boundaries, that love cannot replace safety, that delaying limits is not compassion, but sometimes an act of granting danger more time to grow. It is a lesson in the courage to name a threat accurately, not softening it with gentle language, not hiding it behind hope, not reframing fear as a lack of empathy. There are situations where naming danger clearly does not make you cruel. It makes you responsible. And above all, it is the most essential lesson of all. Empathy, surrender. Empathy is not the same as surrender. Understanding someone's pain does not require you to sacrifice every boundary of your own. These lessons do not exist in abstraction. They are anchored firmly in reality. The case is currently being closely followed by major media outlets such as People and The Guardian, with serious allegations, ongoing legal proceedings, and heightened public attention on how the legal system handles domestic violence within contexts of wealth and fame. This is no longer the private story of a single family. It has become a social cross-section. It stands as a kind of witness, enough to show that a true legacy is not always beautiful. But if it is honest enough, it can prevent another tragedy from repeating itself. The films may continue to be revisited as part of cultural memory, but the real-world legacy of this story lies elsewhere. It forces us to ask harder questions about family, about love, and about the moment when saying no is not a failure, but the last remaining act of courage. In the end, this story does not ask us to choose sides, nor does it require another verdict from the public. Those things belong to the courts and to time. What remains, and what matters more, is what we carry with us after this video ends. From the perspective of a third observer, this is no longer a story about fame or about the collapse of a famous family. It is a stark reminder that even those who spend a lifetime writing beautiful endings can be powerless in the face of real life. And that love, when not paired with boundaries, can become the most dangerous force inside a home. Rob Reiner's legacy will always live on through film, but this real-life story leaves behind a different message. Uncomfortable, yet necessary to say, empathy does not equal surrender. And sometimes saying no is not abandonment. It is the final act of courage needed to prevent a far greater tragedy. So, what is the question that remains for each of us? If you recognize danger quietly growing within your own family, will you choose to keep hoping, or will you choose to set boundaries? At what point does saving the person you love begin to turn into losing yourself? If this story made you pause and reflect, leave a comment. Not to judge, but to help name the things we are so often taught to avoid. Like this video if you believe that boundaries are also a form of love, and subscribe to continue with stories not meant to entertain, but to awaken clarity before everything goes too far.